Hello, everyone. So, let's talk about Inside Out 2 to give you some ideas for the essay. So, Inside Out 2 is Pixar's 28th film, and it's the sequel, obviously, to Inside Out from 2015. It was directed by Kelsey Mann, and he got his inspiration for the story from looking at old childhood photos, specifically at his birthday parties, and he saw that over the years, as he got closer to being a teenager, he started looking less and less happy in those photos. And that sort of is what inspired the story for Inside Out 2. And in the movie, Joy does have that line, maybe you feel less joy as you get older, as you grow up. And we have to ask ourselves as we approach this text, is that true? It seems to be honest, from my life experience and probably y'all's as well, that when you get older, you become self-conscious, as we see happen in the movie with Riley. You start getting anxious, and you worry about your future, and as you become older, the weight of the world starts pushing down on your shoulders a bit more. So that's really what this film is all about, the hurdles of getting older and what that does to your mental health as you try to navigate new situations. And the hockey camp sort of serves as a microcosm of the world, and life in general, with Riley having to find her way like she would out in the real world. Alright, so that's a little bit about where the story came from and what it's all about in general. It did receive positive reviews, as would be expected because Pixar is known for turning out quality movies. And it became the highest grossing animated film of all time, if you can believe it. It broke box office records, so it definitely spoke to people and resonated with them. And it definitely has something going on under the surface, so let's continue to explore what this film is saying. So I think some context will help us understand the film a bit better. So, of course, it follows Inside Out 1. And that's a bit of citational context. Inside Out 1, I bet a lot of y'all have seen it, but if you haven't, just to give a quick little 1 or 2 sentence synopsis, it's basically about the conflict between joy and sadness, and at the end of the movie, the lesson is that sadness can be a good thing, and it's okay to not be okay. In this movie, it seems like they're doing something a bit similar, but with anxiety, and showing how anxiety isn't all bad, and can be useful, or maybe not. We'll continue to see what the film is saying about anxiety itself as we continue through the slides. So, historical context. This began development in 2020. And, 2020, pretty rough time. Worst pandemic in a century. And then this whole decade has been not great. I think we can agree, generally speaking. We just had a major hurricane. We had that chemical fire and all these other things. We have this big election coming up, and it seems the world is ending every other day. We have wars going on in Ukraine and in the Middle East, and it's just a hectic time, isn't it? So it makes sense that during this time in history, we would get a movie about anxiety. Socio-culturally speaking, going along with that, we are in a time where mental health is discussed openly and isn't as stigmatized or taboo as it was in previous decades. And that checks out with the movie openly discussing anxiety and how to deal with it and its consequences if you let it get out of control, etc. I also wanted to note that when this movie was being made, they had the animators, the production team, they had a lot of hardship. And this all came to light recently, like a few weeks ago. This came out. Apparently, they had layoffs where they lost their jobs unexpectedly and they weren't even given notice. They had constant overtime, basically working around the clock to finish this movie. And that is pretty ironic considering it's a movie about mental health and their mental health deteriorated while making it. And they also faced some executive meddling. Disney didn't want there to be any implication that Riley had a crush on Val because a gay crush, that might alienate some people, and they were worried about that. So they were forced, basically, the production team was, to tone that element down and make it clear that Riley likes boys with things like Mount Crushmore and Lance/Blade, who honestly felt really shoved in, didn't he? But anyway, I mentioned that because I thought this scene where anxiety is ruling over the mind workers in Imagination Land, it really seems like they're animators being forced to draw things they don't want to draw, being forced to work overtime. So I think that might have been the animators letting off some steam about their situation. But I also like that scene because it's a parody of a famous commercial. So let's watch that.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the Information Purification Directives. We have created, for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests of vain contradictory thoughts. Our unification of thoughts is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
Let's watch that. So that commercial was an Apple commercial, and it was referencing George Orwell's 1984, which is a dystopian novel about a totalitarian government that the author in the 50s thought might come to pass in 1984. And that fits with the theme of Inside Out 2, the worry about the future, because the future might end up being an apocalyptic wasteland, like in that novel by George Orwell. And, of course, in that scene, the screen is smashed because 1984, the real year, turned out not to be like that dystopian novel. And the movie is also saying, even though things seem like they suck really bad right now, it's not going to turn out that way in the end. And I do think the film, ends on a hopeful note. And to give you some more information to help us understand the movie, its genre, I think, is very significant because this is a Disney movie. And it's also a fantasy film, but it is very true to life, especially that panic attack at the end. That was, when I saw that in the theater this past summer, I nearly had a panic attack. Not really, but it was very realistic. It was spot on as someone, not to overshare, but as someone who has experienced extreme anxiety before. That is exactly what happens. So it's a fantasy movie that's very true to life, so it's sort of subverting its genre. Yes, we're fantasy technically, but we're a film about a very real, not literally real, but a teenage girl who could be any teenage girl in the real world and the struggles she goes through. It also plays with the fact that it's a Disney movie. That's another genre it has. And Disney, is all about happiness, and the Inside Out movies are about how every emotion is good, not just happiness. It's okay to be sad, it's okay to be angry, afraid, and perhaps even anxious. And something else is, at the same time, it warns not to let your anxiety get the best of you. Disney is known as a brand for its emphasis on things like magic and imagination, but you don't want your imagination to get out of control to where you overthink. So I think it definitely is using irony. It's self-aware of its genre, and it's saying, yes, we're a Disney movie, and that commands your attention when they say, but we're a Disney movie that says too much imagination can be a bad thing. So yeah, we see how it plays around with its genre. It also follows another Disney movie that I wanted to show y'all, or a short film rather, from the 1940s, because believe it or not, Inside Out is not the first time Disney has done a movie about personified emotion. So let's take a look at this.
Now, in these strenuous times, it is more important than ever that we control this conflict between reason and emotion. Let's take the case of Mr. John Dokes, who tries to keep up with current events.
Tonight, the news is very grim. Looks bad, folks. We're going to lose this war if we're not very careful.
Hey, you know what I just heard? I heard the subs are sinking all our boats.
I heard on the radio the other night. I got some inside joke because you got to 40 years old.
My son told me that the major told him, pretty bally, pretty bally, pretty
The enemy
bally.
is landing with heavy tanks and guns, and I'm afraid they're going to move right in.
A friend of mine was at Pearl Harbor, and he said,
Extra, extra, read all about it. They're taking all our food and sending it to Europe. While we starve to death, starve to death, starve to death, starve to
You
death.
can't go to work without tires and gasoline.
He's got the right dope.
Don't believe everything you hear.
We're losing. He said so.
Don't be stampeded by hearsay.
I'll believe anything I
You
want
must
to.
use judgment and guard against
Oh, we're in a
That's
mess.
right,
We haven't
emotion.
got a
Go
chance.
ahead.
Control yourself.
Put reason out of the way. That's great. Fine. For Hitler. That master rabble-rouser destroys reason by preying upon the weakness of emotion with fear, sympathy, pride, and hate, just as he did in the minds of the German people. Behold, the Nazi Superman. Let's see how Hitler controlled him through fear. Fear of the concentration camp. Fear of the Gestapo.
I'm scared.
This. Alright, so in that we could see it's quite different from the Inside Out films, because emotion is just one character and instead of several, and reason is a character. And we saw that inside the brain of the Nazi, because this is a propaganda film from World War II, emotion was at the steering wheel, and was bad and needed to be contained by reason. It's more nuanced in the Inside Out movies, where all emotions are good in some way. That's not to say they can't be bad, as we'll see with anxiety, but it definitely is a step. It's a modern version of the old personified emotion movies Disney used to make. They're saying emotion is not necessarily a bad thing. So, that brings me to symbols. So, you have to analyze one symbol for the paper. I picked out 4 that I thought were the most significant, but there are several others. And I wanted to talk about these because I thought they stood out. The sense of self, obviously, is the biggest symbol. And it basically represents, who Riley is. And I wanted to talk about its shape. So, when it is normal and naturally occurring, it is round in shape. But when anxiety introduces the new sense of self, it is angular in shape. So, angles represent, and square looking shapes usually represent artificiality, whereas round, curved shapes usually represent what is natural. So, anxiety introduces a sense of self that is false, that is artificial, that is based on things that aren't true, but that might be true, that anxiety has Riley worrying about. So yeah, I think that explains the different shapes that the sense of self manifests. And by the end of the movie, when Riley has a new sense of self that she's generated herself, it has all of her quote-unquote bad memories and her good memories and all the memories that form all these different beliefs, good and bad, and everything in between. It takes on many different shapes. So that just shows that one's self is never perfect. It can be artificially constructed. It can be based on your experiences, positive and negative, and it can also come from, deep inside yourself. So that's why I think the sense of self takes on round shapes as well as angular shapes. But the film says you need to have a mix of both, because nobody's perfect, obviously. So after the sense of self, you have the red notebook as the next symbol, which I would say represents those things in life that we can't control. Because Riley sees it in her anxious state as determining her entire future. And once she finds out what is written inside of it, then she tries to change her fate, her destiny, or what have you, because the coach says she isn't quite ready yet. And she obviously should never have looked in the first place. She is not acting like her true self by doing something like that. But the book, I think, like I said, it represents things we can't control, and we shouldn't try to control things we can't control, the movie says. And that leads me to the big idea bulb. If you notice in the beginning of the movie, Anxiety had a small idea that she plugged into the console, and that ended up helping Riley make friends with Val at the beginning of camp. So, a little bit of anxiety, it seems, isn't a bad thing. It can help motivate you to do things like find new friends when you're anxious that you might not have any, if you're going to a new school, in this case. But too much anxiety, that's bad, as we can see symbolized by the big idea bulb. The big idea bulb is plugged in, and Riley is given the idea by Anxiety to get 3 goals. And I don't know if there was a pun involved, or a play on words, but there's goals as in literal making a goal in hockey, and then there's goals as in objectives in life. And the 3 goals, I would say, are an unrealistic goal. And when she tries to achieve that unrealistic goal, she ends up hurting herself, she ends up hurting her friend, she gets a panic attack. So I think the big idea bulb represents an overabundance of anxiety and the destructiveness that it can cause, and I think that's really exemplified by its size. I also would say that, sort of to tie it to the sense of self, it is round overall in shape, but here in the middle, it's sort of oblong. It's almost kind of squarish, I would say, because it is going along with what we said with the sense of self, and roundness meaning natural and angular meaning artificial. It's an artificial idea by conjured by anxiety that is not it is not who Riley, it doesn't represent who Riley really is. It represents the construction of her that isn't real, made by anxiety. Speaking of a construction of Riley that isn't real, I think that is represented by the red strand of hair. Riley dyes her hair after the bulb is put in place because she wants to fit in, and she falsely believes the only way to fit in is to be someone you are not. And when she gets to high school with Val and the others, she doesn't have the red strand anymore. So she doesn't think she needs it to be friends with them anymore. She knows she can be herself and still be their friends, and be friends with Bree and Grace also. And if you notice, a nice little touch is at the end of the movie, they don't refer to her as Michigan anymore. They call her Minnesota, because that's where she really is from. So she is her true self by the end of the movie. A few other things I wanted to touch upon. The movie definitely deals with issues of puberty, and I thought it was similar to Turning Red in that regard, another Pixar movie. If you haven't seen it, it's basically about this girl who turns into a red panda, and it can be read as a metaphor for the physical changes of puberty. And they even talk about having your first period and how much of a struggle it is to go through puberty, especially with physical changes, which is represented by the panda. And don't you just feel like a big, hairy, sweaty, gross mess when your body is changing? Inside Out 2 doesn't really talk about the physical changes of puberty. It talks about the mental changes that come with puberty. And, of course, there's that line I mentioned before, where Joy says that you feel less joy as you get older. But is this really the case? Well, I think the film also teaches us that you don't have to give up things you used to love when you were young, as you enter adulthood, as you go through puberty and go into the real world. Bluefy, I think, is a testament to that, because Pouchy, specifically, he's the one who helps the old emotions get back to headquarters. So that just goes to show that things that you used to love can still have a purpose and don't need to be cast into the garbage once you get older. And I think the fact that Nostalgia is a character in this, she seems rather random. She doesn't really do anything. But in terms of the plot, that you don't need her. You could easily take her out of the plot and it wouldn't change anything. But I think her presence is thematic. It goes along with that whole idea of it's okay to still enjoy things from your childhood. It's okay to be nostalgic. It's okay to like Get Up and Glow, that band that Riley pretends not to like when she's not being true to herself. It's okay to keep your old friends even as you move on to a new phase in your life. And it's okay to like things that you liked when you were a kid. And then there's also identity, which we've touched upon as a theme in the previous slides, but just to wrap up the whole idea of identity in the movie. You know, Riley tries to be perfect, is how I would sum it up. But of course, no one is perfect, and your identity can't be perfect, because if you try to make your identity perfect, then you just end up thinking I'm not good enough, and you end up having a panic attack. So, don't try to control what you can't control. Be yourself. You're gonna make mistakes sometimes, because no one's perfect, and that can't be helped. But it's okay to make mistakes, so long as you learn from them and try your best and be yourself. It's a very simple message, but a very powerful one, I would say. And yeah, perfect imperfection. It's okay to be imperfect, and Joy realizes that tossing Riley's bad memories to the back of the mind was a mistake, because Riley's identity is not just her good beliefs, but her bad beliefs. It is her flaws as well as her good qualities, because everyone is a mix of good and bad. No one is completely perfect, and it's okay. That is what the film really teaches us as well. And once you accept that you aren't perfect, as all people should, the film argues, then your anxiety will ease up and it won't control you. Because, of course, you aren't your anxiety. You aren't any of your emotions, the film argues. A person should not define themselves by their emotions. A person is not their emotions. A person uses their emotions. Anxiety can't choose who Riley is, and none of the other emotions can either, including Joy. And Joy sees that, and the other emotions see that when Riley summons Joy at the end of the movie. So yeah, we aren't our emotions. We use our emotions. We summon our emotions. We choose to be happy. And that is what or sad, or whatever we need to be, and that makes a well-adjusted person. And to sort of complete Riley's arc of, going through puberty, at the end we see this image where Joy is at the console, and call me crazy, but it kind of looks like a butterfly. And if you remember, near the beginning of the movie, Mom was talking to Riley about how the changes she's going through is like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly, like they saw at the park. So what is the message of this whole thing? Well, I would sum it up like this, to bring everything we've talked about together. Be true to yourself, and don't let anxiety control you or determine who you are, because no one is perfect, and that's okay. All that said, I do wonder what the film has to say about anxiety itself. Can it be a good thing? Because she does seem to be restrained by the end of the movie, and that seems to be, it seems to be the resolution is she needs to not be at the console. Because she is the antagonist at the end of the day. She's not the villain, necessarily. Because a villain... an antagonist doesn't have to be the villain. An antagonist can be well-meaning, like anxiety was. But I think that's a difficult question that the film potentially doesn't quite answer all the way. Is anxiety a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Well, certainly it can be a bad thing. Can it be good? Maybe, in some cases. It's a complex question, and you might explore in the paper whether the film answers whether anxiety is ever good for anything. And those are my thoughts on Inside Out 2. Thank you guys for listening, and I hope this gives you some ideas as you identify the message of the film in your paper and explain how the film sends that message, and talk about at least one symbol while you do that. Alright, thank you guys, and I'll see y'all in the next one.